The Quiet Panic. This story takes place about 4 months ago, and I'm still getting chills just thinking about what happened. I worked the night shift as a security guard for a telecommunications company downtown. Most nights are pretty quiet, just me monitoring the building and making my rounds every couple hours. But there's this one thing that's been bothering me for weeks now, and I finally decided I had to investigate it myself. Our office building sits right across the street from what used to be St. Mary's General Hospital. The place has been abandoned for over 15 years now. All the windows are boarded up, there's graffiti covering most of the exterior walls, and the parking lot is completely overgrown with weeds. It's honestly one of those buildings that gives you the creeps just looking at it during the day, let alone at night when I'm stuck staring at it for 8 hours straight. About 2 months into working this job, I started noticing something weird. Our phone system would ring at exactly 3:17 every morning. Not 3:15, not 3:20, but 3:17 on the dot. The first few times it happened, I figured it was just some drunk person dialing random numbers. But when I'd answer, there was never anyone on the other end. Just this really faint static noise, almost like the sound you'd hear from an old radio that's not quite tuned to the right station. At first, I didn't think much of it. Working security, you get used to weird stuff happening. But then I started paying closer attention to the pattern. Every single night, 3:17, the phone would ring. I'd pick it up, hear that static for maybe 10 seconds, and then the line would go dead. It became so predictable that I started setting my watch by it. The really strange part was that when I checked the caller ID, it always showed the same number. I wrote it down one night and did some research the next day. Turns out that number belonged to the old hospital across the street, the same hospital that's been completely abandoned and without power for over a decade. I called my supervisor to ask about it, but he just shrugged it off, saying old phone systems sometimes get crossed wires or whatever. But I knew something wasn't right. You don't get consistent calls from a building that doesn't even have electricity running to it. So I started keeping a log of every call, date, time, duration, anything unusual I could hear in the background. Most nights it was just that same static, but occasionally I'd hear something else mixed in. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps echoing in a hallway. Other times I swear I could hear what sounded like medical equipment beeping in the distance. The calls kept coming for weeks. 3:17 every morning without fail. I tried staying off the phone at that time to see what would happen, but it would just keep ringing until I answered. One night I let it ring for almost 5 minutes straight before finally picking up. The static was louder that time, and I could have sworn I heard someone whispering, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. That's when I decided to do something that probably wasn't the smartest idea. I started answering the phone differently. Instead of just saying hello and waiting for the static, I'd try talking to whoever or whatever was on the other end. I'd ask questions like, "Who is this?" or "What do you want?" Most of the time I'd still just get that same static response, but one night something changed. I answered the phone like usual, and after the static started, I said something like, "Look, I know someone's there. What's going on in that hospital?" the static suddenly stopped completely. There was total silence on the line for maybe 3 seconds, and then I heard the clearest thing I'd ever heard during one of these calls. It was a woman's voice, very faint but definitely human. She said, "Help us." The line went dead immediately after that. I sat there staring at the phone for I don't know how long, trying to process what I'd just heard. This wasn't some technical malfunction or crossed wires. Someone was actually trying to communicate with me from that abandoned building across the street. Over the next few nights, the calls continued. But now they were different. Instead of just static, I'd hear bits and pieces of what sounded like conversations. Usually it was too muffled to understand, but every so often I'd catch a word or two. I heard emergency one night, please another night, and once I swear I heard someone say trapped. I started bringing a small recorder to work so I could document these calls better. The audio quality wasn't great, but when I played it back during my breaks, I could definitely make out voices in the background. It sounded like there were multiple people, and they all seemed distressed about something. The weird thing was the voices had this echo to them, like they were coming from somewhere with really high ceilings and concrete walls. By this point, I was completely obsessed with figuring out what was happening. I'd spend my entire shift staring at that hospital building, looking for any signs of activity. No lights ever came on, I never saw anyone going in or out, and during the day when I'd drive past on my way home, the place looked as dead and empty as ever. But the calls kept coming. 3:17 every morning, just like clockwork. And each night the voices were getting clearer. I started to recognize some of them. There was definitely that same woman who had asked for help. But there were also at least 2 men and what sounded like maybe another woman with a much deeper voice. One night, instead of waiting for the call, I decided to try calling that hospital number myself. I dialed it around midnight, figuring if there really was someone there, maybe they'd answer. The phone rang and rang, but nobody picked up. I tried again at 1 in the morning, then 2, but still nothing. It was only when that 3:17 call came in that I could actually connect with whoever was on the other end. That's when I realized something that made my stomach drop. These calls weren't random. Someone or something in that hospital was specifically reaching out at 3:17 every morning, and they were reaching out to me. My direct line at work wasn't listed anywhere publicly. The only way someone could have gotten that number was if they had access to internal company directories or if they were somehow monitoring our phone system. The more I thought about it, the more disturbed I became. What if there really were people trapped in that building somehow? What if they'd been there for months or even years? And this was their only way to try to get help. But then again, how would they have power for a phone? How would they have survived this long, and why would they only be able to call at such a specific time every night? I knew I needed to investigate this further, but I also knew that going into an abandoned building by myself in the middle of the night was probably the dumbest thing I could do. Still, those voices kept getting more desperate each night, and that woman's plea for help was stuck in my head. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find a way into that hospital and figure out what was really going on. But first, I needed to be smart about it. I needed backup, I needed proper equipment, and I needed a plan that wouldn't get me killed if this turned out to be something more dangerous than just confused spirits or whatever was making those calls. Little did I know that my investigation would lead me to discover something far more terrifying than I ever could have imagined. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I needed time to figure out my next move, and I definitely needed some sleep since I'd been losing it over these calls for weeks now. But even during the day, I couldn't stop thinking about that hospital. I drove by it again on my way to grab some coffee, and in the daylight, it looked even more unsettling than at night. The building was massive, probably 8 or 9 stories tall, with rows and rows of boarded-up windows. There were multiple entrances that I could see, but they were all chained shut or blocked off with concrete barriers. The main entrance had this huge sign that said, "Condemned, no trespassing," in bright red letters. But what really caught my attention was something I hadn't noticed before during my nighttime stares from across the street. There was one window on the 4th floor that didn't look quite as boarded up as the others. The plywood covering it seemed loose, like it was hanging at an angle. And for just a split second, I could have sworn I saw something move behind it. It was probably just shadows or maybe a bird that had gotten inside, but it made me even more determined to get in there somehow. I spent the rest of that day researching everything I could find about St. Mary's General Hospital. Turns out the place had a pretty dark history even before it was abandoned. It was built back in the 1940s and had served the community for over 50 years. But in its final decade of operation, there were multiple reports of patient neglect, medical malpractice lawsuits, and even some suspicious deaths that were never fully investigated. The hospital officially closed down after a major scandal involving missing patients. Apparently, several people who had been admitted for routine procedures just vanished from their records. Their families claimed the hospital had no documentation of them ever being there. But the families had admission papers and medical bills to prove otherwise. The whole thing turned into this huge legal mess that eventually forced the hospital to shut down permanently. Reading about those missing patients made my skin crawl. What if they never actually left? What if something happened to them and their voices were somehow still trapped in that building? I know how crazy that sounds, but after weeks of those calls, I was willing to consider any explanation. That evening, I decided to recruit some help. My buddy Marcus works in construction and has access to all kinds of tools and equipment. I called him up and told him I needed his help investigating something, but I didn't go into too much detail about the phone calls. I just said I thought there might be people trapped in the old hospital and that we needed to check it out. Marcus was skeptical at first, but he's always been the type of guy who's up for an adventure. Plus, he'd grown up in this neighborhood and remembered when the hospital was still operating. He said he'd always wondered what the inside looked like after all these years. We agreed to meet up the following night around midnight after my shift ended. I went back to work that night with a completely different mindset. Instead of just passively waiting for the 317 call, I was going to be ready for it. I had my recorder set up, a notebook to write down everything I heard, and a list of questions I wanted to try asking. When the phone rang at exactly 3:17, I answered immediately. But this time, instead of the usual static, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was that same woman's voice from before, but now she sounded panicked. She was talking fast, almost whispering, like she was trying not to be overheard by someone else. She said, "He knows you're coming. Don't come alone. 4th floor, room 409. We're running out of time." Then the line went dead, just like always. I sat there staring at the phone, my hands actually shaking. How could she possibly know I was planning to come to the hospital? I hadn't told anyone except Marcus, and I definitely hadn't mentioned it during any of the previous calls. It was like whoever was in there could somehow see or hear what I was doing from across the street. But what really freaked me out was that room number she mentioned. Room 409 on the 4th floor. That was exactly where I'd seen that loose plywood covering the window earlier that day. It couldn't be a coincidence. I tried calling Marcus right away, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I left him a message telling him we needed to be extra careful, and that something weird was definitely going on in that building. But I also told him I was more convinced than ever that we needed to get inside and help whoever was trapped in there. The rest of my shift dragged by slower than ever. I kept looking at that hospital, focusing on the 4th floor, trying to see if there was any movement behind that loose board. Around 5 in the morning, just as the sun was starting to come up, I saw something that confirmed all my worst fears. There was definitely someone moving around behind that window. I could see a shadow passing back and forth, and at one point I swear I saw a hand press against the glass from the inside. Someone was definitely in there, and they knew I was watching. When Marcus finally called me back around noon, I told him everything. The calls, the voices, what I'd seen that morning, all of it. He was quiet for a long time after I finished, and then he said something that surprised me. He told me his grandfather had worked at that hospital back in the day, and there were always rumors about patients disappearing and strange things happening on the upper floors. He said his grandfather never talked about it much, but he'd mentioned once that there were parts of the hospital that were off limits even to the staff. Rooms that were kept locked and areas where people weren't supposed to go. His grandfather always suspected that the hospital was being used for things beyond just treating patients, but he never found out what. That night, Marcus showed up at my work around 11:30 with a backpack full of equipment. He had flashlights, a crowbar, some kind of electronic device he said could detect motion, and even a first aid kit in case we found people who needed medical attention. He'd also brought bolt cutters to get through any chains or locks we might encounter. We waited until my shift was almost over before making our move. At 3 in the morning, we crossed the street and approached the hospital from the side where there were fewer street lights. The building looked even more imposing up close. The walls were covered in this weird staining that looked almost like water damage, but it had a reddish tint that made it look more sinister. Marcus found a service entrance near the back of the building that had been boarded up. but the boards were old and starting to rot. With the crowbar, we were able to pry them off pretty easily. Behind the boards was a metal door with a chain wrapped around the handles, but the bolt cutters made quick work of that. The second we opened that door, we were hit with this smell that I'll never forget. It was like a combination of disinfectant, mold, and something else I couldn't identify, but made my stomach turn. The air inside felt thick and humid, like the building had been holding its breath for 15 years. We stepped inside and immediately turned on our flashlights. We were in what looked like a service corridor with concrete walls and pipes running along the ceiling. Our footsteps echoed loudly in the empty space, and every sound seemed to bounce around forever before fading away. Marcus whispered that we should head for the stairs and make our way up to the 4th floor. As we walked through those dark corridors, I kept thinking about that woman's voice warning me that he knows you're coming. Who was he, and what did that mean for us? We found a stairwell and started climbing. Each floor we passed looked exactly the same. Long hallways lined with doors, broken ceiling tiles scattered on the floor, and that same awful smell getting stronger the higher we went. But it wasn't until we reached the 4th floor that we realized we weren't alone in that building. As we stepped into the 4th floor hallway, we could hear footsteps somewhere ahead of us. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was pacing back and forth. Marcus grabbed my arm and pointed down the hall. In the beam of his flashlight, we could see that one of the doors was slightly open and there was a faint light coming from inside. Room 409 was at the end of the hall, and that's exactly where the footsteps were coming from. We approached as quietly as possible, but when we got close enough to peek through the crack in the door, what we saw inside made us both freeze in terror. There were people in that room, but they weren't trapped patients who needed our help. They were standing perfectly still, facing the window, and they all looked exactly the same. Same clothes, same posture, same empty expression on their faces. And when one of them slowly turned to look directly at us through that crack in the door, I realized why that woman's voice had warned us not to come alone. We weren't there to rescue anyone. We had walked straight into a trap,